we've known each other for at least 15 years, maybe more.
Probably more.
I think so, and it's really a joy to be here, launching the Lexicon of Change and sharing concepts with you. So
yeah, it's a real pleasure. I mean, as I've mentioned elsewhere, that I've been sort of in the back seat, accompanying you on this journey with the lexicon for quite a while now, for about a decade. And I think that it's extremely important. And I think that this moment of launching the lexicon is a significant one in terms of the role of language underpinning transformation. So I want to start with a big congratulations and appreciation to you for your sort of very persistent work in bringing this into reality.
thank you, and literally, there have been so many people shepherding this project along, and from the very beginning, John Elkington from the UK is
Great.
someone who has coined many words,
Yes.
has been a big champion, and Marcy Murnaghan here in the US. And so we've really been very fortunate to have an incredible array of both scientists and artists and thinkers part of this process. So, and I'm grateful to you. And what I find so inspiring and compelling about this work is that every day I feel like there are new terms coming up, and it's wonderful to learn. And so this is part of why I love this work. Is I love learning new words, and I love honoring the creativity of people who are coining and sharing words. And one of the words that I did want to share from the lexicon is an orientation around justice, because I feel like that is we don't have enough conversations about justice in this work in sustainability. And so one of the concepts that I find really very compelling is this idea of future justice. So how do we build governance systems where we're protecting the rights and the justice of people in the future? And so I'm very inspired by a number of countries that are beginning to think about this and to appoint people who are looking at future justice. And so an interesting example is Hungary, that has a parliamentary commissioner that's focused on future generations. New Zealand, with its parliamentary commissioner for the environment. So I think it's really interesting to think about how the language helps us to create new systems, new structures, new types of governance. And then also Wales, I think, was one of the first to think about Future Generations Act. And
well, it's interesting because, of course, I think that that concept has been baked into to indigenous traditions for many years now. Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederation, integrated that notion of 7 generations. I mean, people think of that, and that's sort of codified in that in the that treaty. Actually, it's not a treaty. I'm sorry. I'm blanking on the correct word for that. But in any case, I think that's become a kind of ubiquitous notion of 7 generations. But I live on Mohegan lands here in Connecticut, on Turtle Island, also known as the United States. And I was recently on their website, and I noticed that they actually think in terms of 14 generations, but not just 14 generations going forward, but also 14 generations going back. And I think that that's actually a profound concept, that they're in active relationship. I mean, first off, many indigenous cultures and worldviews don't see time as a linear progression. They see it as circular or cyclical or spiral. And so having a sort of a distinct relationship that presences the future and the past is really key. And we see this, this notion of responsibility or justice towards the past in things like the Paris Agreement on
Mm-hmm.
climate change that talks about historic responsibility and differentiated capacities. So, and this is something that, in my work, I sort of helped to instigate the Science-Based Targets Initiative, but I've sort of have certain lines of critique of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which seeks to align greenhouse gas emissions reductions with the pace and scale that the science dictates. And one of the things that one would really need to do is to differentiate those what are called decarbonization pathways, or just the pace and scale of reducing your carbon emissions. You need to align that with historic responsibility. And generally speaking,
Mm.
the global north is much more responsible for the industrialization that has resulted in climate change.
Yeah.
And yet, things like the Science-Based Targets Initiative, they're blocking methodologies that integrate this notion of historic responsibility. And so, in other words, overweighting the burden onto companies that are based in the global north, and underweighting responsibility to those who are least responsible for the problem in the first place. So I
Mhm.
like that notion that you're putting out there of sort of future. It reminds me of Kim Stanley Robinson's book, the Ministry of the Future.
Mhm. Yes.
Uh,
Mhm. Mhm. And I'm so grateful that you brought up indigenous knowledge, because I think we need that so much in this moment, and it's something that I'm really eager to build in the lexicon, because I think the framing of things is so helpful from different perspectives. And one of the perspectives that I love about water, for example, is that in many indigenous cultures, water is not a thing. It's a cycle. It's a process. It's dynamic. It's
yes,
and so we think in our culture of water as an object,
right,
and in many cultures, especially indigenous cultures, the idea is water is a flow, a system, a network, a dynamic living process.
right.
So
Well, and
it's a
even
different frame.
sort of semantically or grammatically, we often think in terms of nouns.
Yes.
We being, I'd say, sort of Western or global North culture, instead of thinking in terms of verbs. I mean, when
Yes.
you shift into sort of verbifying everything, and so, for example, in our other conversation, we talked about bioregions,
Yes.
and in the conversations that I'm having around bioregions, we're talking more about bioregioning. And
Uh-huh.
so we're placing less emphasis on, okay, where is the precise boundary of this watershed, for example, and more saying, well, how does just thinking in those terms and having that thought undergird our actions, sort of how does that influence what's happening? And I believe, one person who talks about this very eloquently is Indy Johar with Dark Matter Labs. And
Mhm.
Indy is great. He probably invents a new word with every sentence that he utters. He talked about depropertization, for example, in terms of,
Uh-huh.
that we, the notion of property is actually sort of not indigenous to the world, that we all inherited this world, we're all stewarding it, and the idea of parsing it up into areas that have individual ownership is kind of anathema. It's contrary to nature, if you will, in some senses. I mean, we do want security in a sense of home, but his point is that if we look more at stewarding and less at property ownership, that would be, we would be much more in tune with the way that the world and natural systems work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. Focus on verbs. Absolutely. Oh, this is wonderful to have the chance to talk with you and flesh these things out. And I think you and I have a lot in common in that we work with organizations, both private sector, public sector, to envision change and guide change. And I think that the lexicon is in many ways a gift to organizations, to companies, to governments and cities for these new ways of thinking and new paradigms. So I think it's really helpful. I think you cannot have transformation without vision, and this the lexicon helps create that vision. And I think each of us and each organization comes up with these visions for transformation, and it's good to do that uh, with the language. And I especially am eager for language from other countries. I think it's not helpful to have a conversation in English, and so I'm really grateful for the terms that we have. Um, in Portuguese and Tagalog and French and German and many others. And I hope people will contribute from other as many languages as possible.
Yeah, yeah. Two things come to mind on what you were just mentioning. Just following on that immediate thread, I remember coming across the an instance of the donut, Kate Rayworth's idea
Yes.
of a donut with sort of outer ecological ceilings and inner social foundations, and collaboration with folks from Maori in what's called New Zealand that
Mm-hmm.
essentially looked at that image and um, uh, sort of flipped it on its head. In their culture, everything is spiral,
Yes.
and and also that Earth is the center of everything. And so the idea that ecological boundaries would be on the outside was sort of contrary, or was sort of upside down thinking,
Mm-hmm.
if you will. And
Mm-hmm.
so there were some folks who worked together to translate graphically this idea of sort of Earth being at the center and spiraling out from there. So that's one example of this sort of, that cultures and languages can talk to one another, if you will. And it isn't about sort of one being better than the other. It's about there being productive conversation. And this is sort of
Exactly.
comes into Barbara Wall Kimmerer's ideas around braiding sweetgrass, or
Yes. Yes.
braiding traditional indigenous knowledge systems with Western knowledge systems. And this sort of line of thinking has been taken up by Melanie Goodchild up north of where I'm at in what's
Mm-hmm.
now Canada. And she talks about relational systems thinking, and that's
Mm-hmm.
essentially merging indigenous systems thinking with Western systems thinking. So I do, I would say that it isn't non-productive to have a conversation in English, but it needs to be accompanied by
Yes.
conversations in
Agree.
all sorts of
Yes,
languages. But
absolutely. No, I think you're right. And that's what I find so inspiring and empowering about this work is bringing these visions together. And it's so interesting to learn, for example, about protecting forests and the rainforest and how some of these concepts are emerging in Brazil and other places where there is a really helpful vocabulary in Portuguese about speaking about the rainforest and talking, for example, about the floresta em pé, the standing forest. The importance of having vocabulary for the remaining forest and the forest, the value of the forest
well, and
living.
that this language is not disconnected. There was a recent scientific study that found in British Columbia there are species of bears or subspecies, I forget exactly how you call it, but that their territory, the territory that they roam, is literally connected to indigenous language systems. And so there's a kind of synchronicity or reciprocity, excuse me, is probably a better term, between the literal evolution of species of bears, non-human species, with the language that is spoken in that area by human species. And I just find that fascinating that it sort of amplifies, people could say, oh, why a lexicon of change? What's so important about that? It's like, no, language is absolutely fundamental. And I think this is what you really keyed on to early, Deborah. And it's why I think that the lexicon of change is so important, is that language is absolutely fundamental to our well-being, to our relationship with the earth and with each other, and to evolution.
Yes. Oh, I love that. That's a really helpful point of view. And I also wanted to share kind of the importance of naming. Like, I think,
Yes.
this is a creative act that we have, and one of my favorite terms in the lexicon is the term symbiocene. So a vision for a new era based on mutually beneficial interactions between people, this symbiosis between people, humans, and non-humans, and coined by Glenn Albrecht. And I just think we are so focused on the Anthropocene and this vision which we are in, where humans have impacted in very negative ways the functioning of the planet. But I think it is helpful to articulate a different vision that we can work to, and I think
Right.
symbiosis is a really interesting, helpful construct. And I'm very frequently guided by Christiana Figueres, one of the shepherds of the Paris Agreement, and I think she talks about radical optimism. And I think this work is radical, I think, in many ways, in that we can envision a different future. We must envision a different future, and we have the responsibility to create pathways to get to that vision. So I think the words help us to envision a different future and create those pathways and networks. And a lot of this is about leadership. A lot of the words in the lexicon focus on leadership traits.
Mm-hmm. Well, and radical isn't radical root, to get to the root of a matter. I think that's what it is, and I think that
Yes, yes,
so
yes.
roots of words is also key. So
I
the
love
the,
that.
the roots
Yes.
that sort of ground or anchor a concept, and then if we follow that through, there's sort of the branches of continual growth
Mm-hmm,
of
mm-hmm.
concepts, so that they have sort of both a connection to the past and sort of grounding in where they've come from, but they also see themselves as sort of living and can branch out. And I think a wonderful example of that is going back to a word you mentioned earlier, paradigm. So the term paradigm was essentially, languishing dormant in the English language for centuries. And it wasn't until Thomas Kuhn, in his 1962 book, The Structures of Scientific Revolution, that he really took this. He basically plucked this term paradigm out of obscurity, and now you can't go 5 minutes without hearing about systems change or paradigm shifts, excuse me. And so I think that's an example of taking existing language and breathing new life into it. So I think the lexicon isn't just about sort of creating new terms.
Yes.
I think it's also about sort of reclaiming existing terms, if you will.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I really am grateful that you're bringing that up, because our colleague Marcy Murninghan, she looks at what the term fiduciary. So
Yes.
how do we re-envision what that means? That trust in systems. So fiduciary, creating new visions of that. And then a wonderful colleague and friend, Elizabeth Swanson, who teaches about human rights. She talks about human. What does it mean to be human? And I think these are really important questions. And so it's not all new words, but
Right.
it is thinking about the language that we use. And I think much of the language that we use is has a shadow over it,
Yeah.
and being aware of those connotations, sometimes racist, sometimes misogynist. I think it's helpful
That's
to
right.
examine language in that way. And I think this is a really important uh, part of the work that I do with companies, is to get them to think about their own vocabulary. And so
Yes.
how they communicate, what they communicate, what matters to them. And I think this is really helpful to, and many companies, even some of the companies that we admire for their work in sustainability, don't have even within their company a shared vocabulary or
Right.
even their own way of speaking. And so I think it's really crucial that companies and organizations work through the vision and the language that they want to bring, because we can all be agents of change.
Yeah, well, I mean, think about it. There's been sort of centuries of solidification of, ways of looking at language and ways of being that are problematic. Like I'm reading a book by Bell Hooks right now called The Will
Mm-hmm.
to Change, and she talks about using the term imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. And so, she puts all of those together and she says, if you look at it, those systems, each of those systems, imperialism, white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy, have been having adverse, unjust, to come back to our question about
Mm-hmm.
justice, that are sort of embedded not just in our sort of economic and social systems, but literally embedded in our language.
Yes,
So if
it's
we're
true.
to kind of, and she also points that, it isn't just women who are feminists or who can be feminists. Certainly men can be pro-feminist as well. And it isn't just men who are patriarchal, that there are many instances of women sort of solidifying or enacting patriarchal ways of being. So I think that there is, as I mentioned earlier, there's a liberatory aspect of reclaiming our language and looking at the way that it's rooted in unjust systems and ways of being and transforming that through transforming the language.
Exactly. I think that's really helpful, and it really gives us a responsibility and a mission. And I find this work very inspiring. One of the terms I learned as I was doing this work is a term from Hawaiian. I don't know if you've heard the term kuleana, but it's a really interesting term from Hawaiian language that is a responsibility that comes with honor, that is like kind of, and I love the concept that we the kuleana, to take care of the earth. It's a responsibility, and it comes with honor. Like it's a mission, and I love that aspect of that this is a responsibility that we have to take care of the earth, and also to be very intentional about our language, and how we deploy our words. I think really matters.
Right. And I think responsibility, can be seen as heavy, but
Yes.
I mean, I don't know about you, but I find so much joy in language. I'm
Yes.
always, I love it when a joke, suggests itself. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Like when the language is doing the work and I just act or we just act. as a kind of conduit for it. So again, I see we're running short on time here. So this feels like a good place to wrap up around
I
this
think so too.
sort of
Yes,
honoring of that dual responsibility and joy.
absolutely. Well, I love the chance to talk with you, and I look forward to future collaborations. And thank you so much. It's great to share this moment.
Oh, it's an honor, Deborah. I've really been so appreciative of your work over the years in bringing greater clarity to the world that we live in. So thank you for stewarding the launch of the Lexicon of Change.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and yes, a great way to start the year.
Indeed.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you, Deborah.
Take care.